is West Africa. So here's your question. How would you describe the ancient West African kingdoms? And what about the people there and their culture?
Throughout Africa, there are great stories and legends of the great African empires of the Middle Ages. The history of the great West African kingdoms is largely passed down through the works of only a few medieval scholars from the regions, but also the griots. Griots or Jali are sorts of animist priests of West Africa that maintain a history of the land through oral storytelling, music, performance, and poetry. Through these sources, historians piece together the chronology of the three great ancient African empires and kings of West Africa, which all took turns and struggled for the chance of upholding their own empires under the Africa.
There are three great West African kingdoms that competed and allied for control over the trans-Saharan trade routes that stretched from the Red Sea and the Mediterranean all the way to the Atlantic coast of Africa. The three kingdoms were Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. Trans-Saharan trade linked the Mediterranean economies that demanded gold and could supply salt to the sub-Saharan economies where gold was abundant. Trans-Saharan trade developed because valuable trade goods existed on both sides of the desert. In order for people on either side to acquire these goods, they had to trade with one another, which required crossing the desert. Trade through the Sahara had many impacts. It increased wealth in North Africa, West Africa, and beyond. It resulted in the spread of Islam to West Africa. A negative impact was that it also resulted in millions of people being enslaved. Trade was conducted by caravans of camels. According to Ibn Battuta, the explorer who accompanied one of the caravans, the average size per caravan was 1,000 camels, but some caravans were as large as 12,000. The caravans would be guided by highly paid Berbers who knew the desert and could ensure safe passage from their fellow desert nomads. The Kingdom of Ghana. The Kingdom of Ghana arose from the group of people known as the Soninke or Sarakoli. Soninke people live in the southern portions of modern-day Mauritania and Bali, between the Niger River and Senegal River, in the region called Ouagadougou in the oral traditions. The Soninke spoke the language called Mande, and their beginnings of what became the Ghana Kingdom date back to as early as the 6th century Common Era. The Kingdom of Ghana arose around a conglomerate of Soninke villages that were ruled by a single king. The Ghana kings were absolute monarchs. They ruled as a state and represented justice and the religion of the people. The Soninke were animists and worshipped their ancestors and the spirits of nature. The king did have advisors, officials, and Muslim merchants used as interpreters for the African Muslim kingdoms to the east. The king's entourage of advisors, interpreters, and officials would help him manage Ghana's economy and the goods pouring in and out of the kingdom through the trans-Saharan trade. The king of Ghana likely ruled from the capital city called Kombesale, which is also sometimes simply called Ghana. Kombesale was eventually sacked by the Almoravids of North Africa. As previously mentioned, the West African economy was largely based on the trans-Saharan trade routes. The Ghana Empire developed the trans-Saharan trade routes through the use of camels. When the Kingdom of Ghana controlled the trans-Saharan trade routes, it controlled the tax and the flow of goods such as gold, hides, salt, ivory, fabrics, and slaves. Much of the gold throughout the Africa came from panning the rivers of Africa such as the Niger and Senegal. Besides taxing this trade, the Ghana Empire also had its own industry and resources such as iron and gold from the gold fields of bamboo. The elites of Ghana would trade this gold for luxury goods such as fine textiles, copper, beads, and horses which were brought in from the north. However, merchants and traders could trade only in gold dust, and only the kings of Ghana Empire could own gold nuggets. This allowed them to control the gold markets by preventing inflation of gold in the markets. The rise of the Soso Kingdom in West Africa is closely linked to the decline of Ghana Empire, which had dominated the region for centuries. The Soso Kingdom emerged as a major power in the 12th century under the leadership of Sumanguru Kante. Sumanguru Kante was a skilled warrior and leader who took advantage of the political and economic instability that had beset the Ghana Empire to expand his own territory. He established his capital at Soso, which was located in what is now present-day Mali, and built a powerful army that was feared throughout the region. The Soso Kingdom was known for its military strength and its use of cavalry, which gave it significant advantage in battle. It also controlled the important trade routes, including those that passed through the city of Kombisale, which had been the capital of the Ghana Empire. However, the Soso Kingdom's reign was short-lived. In the early 13th century, a new leader emerged in the region, Sundiata Keita, who was the founder of the Mali Empire. Sundiata Keita led a coalition of smaller kingdoms against the Soso Kingdom, defeating Sumanguru Kante in a decisive battle in 1235. The defeat of the Soso Kingdom marked the end of its brief reign as a major power in West Africa, and paved the way for the rise of the Mali Empire, which would go on to dominate the region for centuries to come. The Mali Kingdom rose when the brief Soso Kingdom began to impose too many trade restrictions on the region of modern Mali. The native peoples in the region belonging to the Malinke tribe rebelled against the Soso. The politics of the Mali Kingdom revolved around the king. Sundiata Keita named the empire Mali, and also established that only members of his Keita clan could ever ascend to the throne and became king. However, the laws of succession were not established in detail, such as their necessarily being the eldest son, and so disputes over succession become a problem. The king or Mansa would be assisted by local chiefs and elders at assemblies in order to discuss issues of the ruling. While making use of legal advisors, the Mansa was also the Supreme Court Justice, Chief of the Army, and Master of the Granaries and Treasury. The Mali Empire began to decline in the 15th century, largely due to its poorly defined rulers for succession and the civil wars that this often caused between family members fighting over the throne. As the trade opened outside Mali, other kingdoms began to grow and obtain wealth, notably the Songhai, who eventually conquered the Mali Kingdom. The Mali Empire's military was poorly equipped for the era and was attacked in 1433 by the Mosi, and then again in 1464 by the Songhai, who were superiorly armed and took the entire Mali Empire. The Mansa of Mali, like the kings of Ghana, were the only ones allowed to own gold nuggets, while the traders and merchants had to hold and exchange gold dust. If a gold nugget was found or obtained, it would have to be exchanged for gold dust in the treasury. This allowed the Mansa to control the entire gold economy and help regulate inflation. The Mali Empire also traded in salt and copper as well as gold. The region of Mansa Musa, however, saw an extravagant display of wealth of gold in his pilgrimage to the east. While traveling in a giant caravan, Mansa Musa brought with him thousands of pounds of gold. He would generously give the gold to the poor when entering towns and cities along the route of his pilgrimage. However, he gave away so much gold that the inflation caused a massive devaluating of gold and collapsed the entire economy along his route.
During the 13th century, Mansa Musa conquered the kingdom of Gao. 2 centuries later, the kingdom of Gao rose again as the Songhai Empire. King Soni Ali captured much of the empire of Mali. The Songhai's borders extended far beyond any previous West African empire. The Songhai state patronized Islamic institutions and sponsored public buildings, mosques, and libraries. One notable example is the Great Mosque of Jenny, which was built in the 12th or 13th century.
By the 16th century, there were several centers of trade and Islamic learning in the Niger Bend region, most notably the famed Timbuktu. Arab chroniclers tell us that the pastoral nomadic Tuareg founded Timbuktu as the trading outpost. The city's multicultural population, regional trade, and Islamic scholarship fostered a cosmopolitan environment. In 1325, the city's population was around 10,000. At its apex in the 16th century, the population is estimated to have between 30,000 and 50,000. Timbuktu attracted scholars from throughout the Muslim world. The Songhai Empire ended when Morocco conquered the state in 1591. The fall of the Songhai marked the decline of big empires in West Africa. Merchant scholars in Timbuktu and other major learning centers dispersed, transferring learning institutions from urban-based merchants' families to rural pastoralists throughout the Sahara. During this period, there was an alliance between scholars, who were also part of the merchants' class, and some warriors who provided protection for trade caravans around the 12th and 13th century. Mystical Sufi Brotherhood orders began to spread in the region. Sufi orders played an integral role in the social order of African Muslim societies and the spread of Islam through the region well into the 20th century. In the southern half of the African continent, from the Great Basin of the Congo River to the Cape of Good Hope, states formed somewhat more slowly than in the north. Until the 11th century Common Era, most of the peoples in this region lived in what are sometimes called non-centralized societies, characterized by autonomous villages organized by clan and ruled by a local chieftain or clan head. One area where this process occurred was the Congo River Valley, where the combination of fertile land and nearby deposits of copper and iron enabled the inhabitants to enjoy the agricultural surplus and engage in regional commerce. Two new states in particular underwent this transition. The Kingdom of Luba was founded in the center of the continent, in a rich agricultural and fishing area near the shores of Lake Kisale. Luba had a relatively centralized government in which the king appointed provincial governors who were responsible for collecting tribute from the village chiefs. At about the same time, the Kingdom of Congo was formed just south of the mouth of the Congo River on the Atlantic coast. The Khoi in the San or Khoisan, which is the combination of the two groups Khoi, the herders, and the San, the hunter-gatherers. Khoi were the first native people to come into contact with the Dutch settlers in the mid-17th century. The Khoisan were the first inhabitants of southern Africa and one of the earliest distinct groups of Homo sapiens. Khoisan spread throughout the western half of South Africa. The two were related because of their click language, in which clicks are like consonants. Linguists believe that the more clicks you have, the older the language is. As the Dutch took over land for farms, the Khoiker were dispossessed, exterminated, or enslaved, and therefore their numbers reduced. Generalizing about social organization, cultural development, and daily life in traditional Africa is difficult because of the extreme diversity of the continent and its inhabitants. 1/4 of all the languages in the world are spoken in Africa, and 5 of the major language families are located there. Ethnic divisions are equally pronounced because many of these languages did not have a system of writing. Until fairly recently, historians must rely on accounts by occasional visitors, such as Ibn Battuta. Such travelers, however, tended to come into contact mostly with the wealthy and the powerful, leaving us to speculate about what life was like for ordinary African during the early period. African towns were mostly walled villages, while in rural, villages usually are open and composed of a single lineage group or clan that is governed by own clan heads. In the towns of African, the center of government and the teeming markets were filled with goods from distant regions. Here also were artisans skilled in metalworking or woodworking, pottery making, and other crafts. In the states of West Africa, the focal point of the major towns was the royal precinct. The relationship between the ruler and the merchants class differed from the situation in most Asian societies, where the royal family and the aristocracy were largely isolated from the remainder of the population. In the city-states of East African coast, the rulers were often wealthy merchants who, as in the case of the town of Kilwa. The majority of Africans lived in small rural villages. Their identities were established by the membership in a nuclear family and a lineage group, which is the basic building block of African society. They lived in small round huts constructed of packed mud and topped with a conical thatch roof. In most early societies, women were usually subordinate to men in Africa. But in some cases, they were valued for the work they could do or for their role in the increasing the size of the lineage group. Polygyny was common at this time, particularly in Muslim societies. Women often worked in the fields while the men of the village tended the cattle or went hunting expeditions. In some communities, the women specialized in commercial activities. In one area in South Africa, young girls were sent into the mines to extract gold because of their smaller physiques. There were some key differences between the role of women in Africa and elsewhere. In many African societies, lineage was matrilinear rather than patrilinear. Women were often permitted to inherit property, and the husband was often expected to move into his wife's house. Relationships between the sexes were also sometimes more relaxed than in China or India. Women also had major roles as brokers and intermediaries in trade centers along the Saharan and Atlantic littorals. Slavery did not originate with the coming of the Europeans. However, it had been practiced in Africa since ancient times and probably originated when prisoners of war were forced into perpetual servitude. Slavery was common in ancient Egypt and became especially prevalent during the New Kingdom, when slaving expeditions brought back thousands of captives from the Upper Nile to be used in different kinds of servitude. Human sacrifice was common in West African states up to and during the 19th century. Some were enrolled as soldiers or military slavery that involves the acquisition and training of conscripted military units, which would retain the identity of military slaves even after their service. And some revolve around domestic slavery, where slaves would work primarily in the house of the master but retain some freedoms. Domestic slaves could be considered part of the master's household and would not be sold to others without extreme costs. While chattel slavery is a specific servitude relationship where the slave is treated as the property of the owner. As such, the owner is free to sell or treat the slave as he would other pieces of property. And the children of the slave often are retained as the property of the master. Pawnship, on the other hand, or debt bondage slavery, involves the use of people as collateral to secure the repayment of debt. Slave labor is performed by the debtor or a relative of the debtor. usually a child. Pawnshop was a common form of collateral in West Africa. It involved the pledge of a person or a member of that person's family to serve another person providing credit. Africa's creative expression, whether in the form of painting, literature, or music, was above all the means of serving religion and the social order. Though to the uninitiated, a wooden mast or the bronze and iron statuary of southern Nigeria is simply a work of art, to the artist, it was often means of expressing religious convictions and communal concerns. Indeed, some of African historians reject the use of the term art to describe such artifacts because they were produced for spiritual or moral rather than aesthetic purposes. Like sculpture and wood carving, African music and dance often serve a religious function. With their characteristic heavy rhythmic beat, dances were a means of communicating with the spirits, and the frenzied movements that are often identified with African dance were intended to represent the spirits acting through the humans. A wide variety of African instruments include xylophones, bells, horns, and flutes, also stringed instruments like fiddle, harp, and zither. African music served as the primary means of transmitting folk legends and religious traditions from generation to generation. Literature in the sense of written works did not exist in sub-Saharan Africa during the early traditional period. They only had bard, a professional storyteller, an ancient African institution by which history was transmitted orally from generation to generation. They have similar role with the griots who also preserve social customs and the entertainers who possess a monopoly over the playing of several musical instruments.